Have you ever noticed that peculiar pattern in your attractions? That mysterious pull toward people who somehow mirror your own qualities, reflect your own values, embody traits strikingly similar to your own. You find yourself drawn to them with an intensity that feels almost inevitable, convinced that this mirroring represents perfect compatibility, certain that recognizing yourself in another person signifies the ultimate connection. Society calls this natural attraction, finding your match, or simply clicking with someone. But the answer lies somewhere deeper, somewhere more unsettling, something that challenges everything we thought we understood about romantic choice. Because when you find yourself powerfully drawn to someone who reminds you of yourself, you aren't experiencing the pinnacle of healthy attachment. You're witnessing what Freud identified as narcissistic object choice, perhaps the most seductive yet problematic form of attraction. And that recognition doesn't come with romantic reassurance or validating explanations. It comes with a profound warning about the psychological pitfalls of loving what is essentially a reflection of yourself, a cautionary insight that most people spend their entire romantic lives avoiding. No, you're not shallow, you're human, you're not self-absorbed. You've simply encountered what Freud recognized as one of our most primordial patterns of attachment. There's something profoundly revealing about our attraction to those who mirror us, because that pattern shatters our romantic narratives about compatibility, dismantles our belief in the virtue of shared qualities, and reveals a brutal truth. Most attractions to our own reflection aren't about genuine otherness at all. And most of us are still learning to recognize ourselves in that silent yet deafening mirror of psychological projection. Freud distinguished between anaclitic object choice, attachment to a complementary other, and narcissistic object choice, attachment to a reflection of self. And this mysterious pull toward those who mirror our own qualities is actually a manifestation of what he called primary narcissism at work. It's what many experience but few have the courage to examine. They don't question the suspicious familiarity of their attractions. They celebrate it. They don't wonder why they're consistently drawn to variations of themselves. They're less interested in psychological truth and more in maintaining the comforting belief that similarity equals compatibility. And that makes relationships treacherous, because while we believe we're choosing genuine connection, our unconscious has discovered the intoxicating power of extended self-love, disguised as partner selection. The person who consistently falls for reflections of themselves isn't simply expressing preference. They're operating from a specific mode of object choice, a pattern where attraction isn't about complementarity, it's about similarity, where chemistry isn't about difference, it's about sameness. And maybe that's why it creates such immediate comfort, such certainty, such powerful confirmation of one's own qualities and choices. But what many still don't understand is that behind their seemingly natural attraction to similarity is a psyche working exactly as Freud described, seeking not the genuinely other, but a socially acceptable extension of self-love. You don't desire difference, you desire confirmation. And until you recognize this fundamental pattern, you exist in a state of psychological confusion, mistaking narcissistic extension for genuine connection. Maybe you don't recognize yourself in this right now. Maybe you think it's cynical, reductive, or an oversimplification of your complex attractions. But deep down, way deep down, there's a question inside you, a quiet one that pulses even when you try to ignore it. What if your consistent attraction to people who mirror your own qualities isn't about compatibility, but about narcissism? Your psyche seeking the comfortable affirmation of sameness rather than the challenging growth of genuine otherness. The mysterious pull toward those who remind us of ourselves is not healthy compatibility, it's narcissistic continuity. And those who don't understand Freud's distinction between types of object choice often mistake extended self-love for ideal partnership throughout their entire lives. But what few people see is that we don't create this pattern consciously. It emerges from what Freud identified as primary narcissism, the the fundamental self-cathexis that precedes genuine object love. Freud believed that a certain amount of narcissism is necessary for healthy self-preservation, but when it dominates our romantic choices, it creates relationships based not on genuine otherness, but on the affirmation of sameness. And maybe that's why so many still find themselves inexplicably drawn to people who share their qualities, mirror their values, and essentially reflect, rather than complement them. Pulled by a primitive mode of attachment that their conscious mind romanticizes as perfect compatibility. While most people claim their attraction to similarity represents ideal matching, the unconscious knows the profound comfort of narcissistic extension. And there, in the midst of what we call compatibility, they've encountered not genuine otherness, but psychological continuity. Early experiences when self-love became the template for object choice, when their psyche developed patterns of attachment based more on similarity than complementarity. Their attraction to reflections of themselves didn't develop from rational assessment, but from the unconscious extension of what Freud called primary narcissism. What registered wasn't the genuine otherness of potential partners, but how well they confirmed and extended the self. What emerged wasn't object love, but self-love by proxy. And that pattern becomes psychologically compelling because it combines the illusion of connection with the profound comfort of narcissistic affirmation. This person knows genuine difference is challenging. They've experienced it. They've had relationships with people who truly complemented rather than mirrored them, who brought genuine otherness rather than comfortable similarity. But somehow, those relationships often lack the immediate comfort, the certainty, the instinctive rightness of connections with those who essentially reflect their own qualities. And that difference wasn't created randomly. It reflects the fundamental distinction Freud identified between the challenging growth of anaclitic attachment and the comfortable affirmation of narcissistic object choice. What registered in their psychological development wasn't just the possibility of genuine otherness, but the profound security of extended self-love. What emerged wasn't just the capacity for complementary attachment, but the gravitational pull toward what essentially affirms rather than challenges the self. They don't want just any connection. They want the comfortable certainty that comes with narcissistic recognition. They're no longer choosing partners based on genuine complementarity, but on the degree to which they extend and affirm the self. So maybe that's why their relationships often feel immediately right yet ultimately limiting. Because it's not about genuine exchange, but narcissistic confirmation, and that takes more than surface-level similarity to establish. It takes the unconscious recognition of oneself in another, where few are willing to acknowledge that what feels like perfect compatibility might actually be the extension of self-love, rather than genuine connection with otherness. And that's where many relationships founded on similarity ultimately stagnate. Not because compatibility failed, but because what appeared as ideal matching was actually narcissistic object choice, creating relationships with profound comfort but limited potential for genuine growth through difference. They don't want to merely perpetuate, they want to understand. Until then, they experience these attractions not as conscious narcissism, but as the inevitable expression of patterns they didn't create but inherited from the structure of psychological development itself. This person isn't deliberately self-absorbed. They're patterned. There's a vast difference between conscious self-love and unconscious narcissistic object choice. But the world doesn't easily accept the complexity of this insight. A world that still romanticizes similarity. A world that still celebrates finding someone just like you as the pinnacle of compatibility, as something ideal rather than potentially limiting. Freud might suggest that a certain degree of narcissism in object choice is inevitable, but when it dominates our selections, it creates relationships founded more on self-extension than genuine otherness. But perhaps our greatest confusion comes not from experiencing this pattern, but from misinterpreting it. And this person's consistent attraction to reflections of themselves doesn't operate by conscious choice. It follows psychological structure. They hear phrases like, You two are so alike. No wonder you're perfect together. It's like you found your other half. You have so much in common. And inwardly they embrace these affirmations because they're far more comfortable than the possibility that what they're experiencing is narcissistic object choice, the extension of self-love rather than genuine connection with otherness. They're not experiencing ideal compatibility. They're experiencing narcissistic continuity, someone who doesn't complement their qualities, but essentially mirrors them. And let's be honest, that's not something directed by ideal matching, but established through psychological development. The comfortable certainty they feel isn't mysterious, but precisely calibrated. Their psyche identifying in others the qualities that already exist within themselves. They're living proof that narcissistic object choice feels profoundly right despite its limitations. And that disrupts our cultural narratives. Perfect matching feels questionable. Similarity seems less ideal. But they aren't experiencing the pinnacle of healthy attachment. They're responding to patterns formed before they had any concept of their limiting implications. And the powerful feeling of rightness they experience with those who mirror them is by itself a brutal indicator of how deeply narcissistic object choice can disguise itself as ideal compatibility. This person isn't deliberately self-involved by nature. They don't consciously seek mere reflections. They understand intellectually the potential value of genuine difference. And for that, they carry a double burden. Both the comfortable certainty of similarity and the intellectual awareness that what feels perfect might actually be limiting. They seek connection, while psychological conditioning pulls them toward what essentially affirms rather than challenges them. They long for growth, while their attractions reliably lead them toward variations of themselves with almost mathematical precision. And when they meet someone who mirrors their qualities, it's not ideal compatibility, it's narcissistic recognition. When they experience that profound feeling of immediate rightness, it's not perfect matching, it's self-love extended to an external object. When they find themselves powerfully drawn to someone with striking similarities, it's not destiny, it's psychological continuity. And that internal battle between romantic narratives and psychological reality is their greatest struggle. Because they don't consciously choose to be drawn to reflections of themselves, they're driven by patterns of object choice, largely operating beyond awareness. And that divided self, between what they romanticize as perfect compatibility and what psychology identifies as narcissistic extension, is what makes their relationship patterns so difficult to transcend through conscious intention alone. Perhaps what unsettles people most about this perspective isn't its unromantic nature. It's the uncomfortable truth it reveals about the nature of attraction itself. Freud taught that our choice of love objects often reveals more about our relationship with ourselves than our capacity for genuine otherness. But what happens when what we call compatibility is itself largely the unconscious extension of self-love? It was precisely that question that exposes why relationships based on striking similarity often provide immediate comfort yet limited growth. It wasn't by cosmic matching. It was a psychological pattern that emerged from what Freud identified as primary narcissism, the fundamental self-cathexis that can extend to objects that essentially mirror rather than complement the self. They no longer experience these attractions through purely romantic narratives. They're beginning to glimpse psychological patterns. And that changes everything. How many times have you wondered why you're consistently drawn to people who share your qualities, mirror your values, essentially reflect rather than complement you? How many times have you felt that immediate, powerful certainty with someone who seemed like a version of yourself? This person has felt that too. They once thought these powerful attractions represented ideal compatibility, guiding them toward their perfect match. But one day, they began to question whether what they were experiencing was healthy complementarity or narcissistic object choice. And that day, they made the first step toward understanding an attraction pattern that had been romanticized, yet potentially limiting their relational growth. Their path toward clarity is not a straight line. There are days of romantic interpretation, Moments when compatibility feels like the only explanation. Nights of wondering why relationships with such striking similarity often lack growth. But there's also a growing understanding that illuminates what was once completely misinterpreted. They learned that what they call ideal compatibility often has very little to do with genuine otherness at all. The mysterious feeling of immediate rightness is not perfect matching, but narcissistic recognition. The powerful certainty they experience is not destiny, but the extension of self-love to an external object. And until that fundamental misinterpretation is corrected, they choose to begin examining rather than simply romanticizing these comfortable attractions. Not out of cynicism, but out of the necessity for psychological honesty. This person is the living embodiment of Freud's insight that our choice of love objects often reveals more about our relationship with ourselves than our capacity for genuine otherness. They've been shaped by what Freud called primary narcissism, formed by patterns of object choice that prioritize similarity over complementarity, pulled by attractions so consistent that they reveal not cosmic matching, but psychological continuity. And now that they're beginning to recognize the pattern, they face the monumental task of separating romantic narratives from psychological reality. They don't want just to romanticize their attraction to sameness. They want to understand how it potentially limits genuine growth through difference. That's challenging because it requires not just intellectual understanding, but psychological honesty. And sadly, few undertake this difficult journey. Most still mistake narcissistic object choice for ideal compatibility, self-love extension for cosmic matching, the comfort of sameness for the pinnacle of healthy attachment. And if they still find themselves powerfully drawn to people who mirror them today, it's because every instance activates deeply established patterns. Every experience of immediate rightness they feel with someone similar represents not ideal compatibility, but narcissistic object choice. Every comfortable certainty they encounter follows trajectories established through psychological development rather than cosmic alignment. They're beginning to see the pattern without yet knowing how to transcend it. And that awareness, born from honest self-observation, transforms their relationship to these powerful attractions. Because a person who has glimpsed the psychological reality behind what they thought was ideal, compatibility becomes awakened. Not because the pattern immediately changes, but because they've begun to see what was previously romanticized. The person who consistently falls for those who remind them of themselves is not experiencing the pinnacle of healthy attachment. Something inside them is operating through narcissistic object choice. And it was precisely that pattern that created both their comfortable certainty and the potential for their eventual growth beyond it. Because sometimes, only in recognizing psychological reality can we begin the long process of genuine choice. Freud suggested that making the unconscious conscious is the beginning of psychological freedom. And that's exactly what they've begun to undertake. They're reconnecting with how their patterns of object choice developed, facing the reality of how profoundly primary narcissism shapes what feels like perfect compatibility, patterns that weren't consciously chosen but emerged from the very structure of psychological development itself. They disrupted romantic narratives by making them conscious. They began questioning what they thought was ideal compatibility, not by becoming cynical, but by becoming psychologically honest. They learned that their attraction to those who mirror them wasn't cosmic matching, but narcissistic object choice, the extension of self-love rather than the embrace of genuine otherness. And when they stopped simply romanticizing these comfortable attractions, they began the more nuanced work of truly seeing the pattern clearly. First with resistance, then with recognition, and finally with the clarity necessary for any genuine transformation. Because someone who has seen the psychological reality behind what they called perfect compatibility no longer mistakes narcissistic object choice for ideal matching quite so unconsciously. They learn to notice when they're experiencing narcissistic attraction, to honor the reality of their comfortable response while not being completely controlled by it. They're not instantly transformed. They simply no longer act completely unconsciously. There's a world of difference between blind romanticization and pattern observed with growing awareness. They still feel the powerful pull toward those who mirror them. Yes, but they've begun to recognize it as narcissistic object choice rather than ideal compatibility. Not with self-judgment or harsh criticism, but with the curious attention of someone who genuinely wants to understand, rather than simply continue limiting their relational growth through unconscious patterns. Their awareness has become an ally rather than an enemy. Their recognition is a new capacity. They can begin to distinguish between narcissistic attraction and genuine appreciation of otherness. And they don't hesitate to question what once seemed like the mysterious, ineffable nature of perfect compatibility itself. Their transformation isn't immediate. It's gradual. It's as if they've tapped into an ancient understanding, an old wisdom that humans aren't destined to blindly perpetuate narcissistic object choice, but can, through awareness, begin to make more conscious selections, not to deny the comfort of similarity, but to recognize its limitations and expand beyond them. And in accessing that understanding, something awakens in them, a psychological freedom, emotional maturity, a person who, though still susceptible to narcissistic attraction, is no longer completely mystified by it. They're in communion with something greater, with the possibility of choice beyond pattern perpetuation. And no matter how deeply established their tendency toward narcissistic object choice, nothing remains completely romanticized when illuminated by genuine self-awareness. They no longer simply follow their comfortable attractions blindly. They observe them with growing clarity. They're no longer helplessly perpetuating narcissistic object choice without understanding the process. They do the psychological work. And that shift from unconscious romanticization to conscious recognition changes everything about their relationship to these powerful attractions. But they're no longer identified completely with their patterns. They've already begun to see beyond them. And in that seeing, they discovered that genuine connection might feel completely different from the comfortable certainty of narcissistic recognition. Less immediately affirming, but more genuinely growth-producing through the challenge of authentic otherness. There's something profound about the way they now approach these powerful attractions. They don't need to deny their reality. Their awareness is expanding, and it's in that expansion that their true freedom lives. Freud might say that bringing unconscious patterns into consciousness doesn't eliminate their power, but allows us to relate to them differently. And perhaps that's why this person, in choosing to understand, rather than simply romanticize, has become someone capable of eventually making choices beyond the comfortable limitation of narcissistic object choice. They no longer try to simply mythologize their attraction to similarity or convince anyone that their consistent pattern represents cosmic matching. They don't deny the reality of their powerful experiences, because they've learned that psychological patterns transform not through romanticization, but through recognition. And when they feel that familiar, comfortable pull towards someone who essentially mirrors them, they now pause. They don't engage in idealized thinking or immediate certainty. They observe with the dignity of someone who's followed this pattern enough times to recognize its signature. What few people understand is that this person still experiences genuine attraction. They still feel the powerful immediacy, the recognition, the comfortable certainty with those who mirror them. But they want to understand these experiences through psychological reality rather than romantic mythology, with honest awareness rather than idealized interpretation, with the courage to recognize when they're potentially limiting their own growth through narcissistic object choice. Now, they only offer themselves where there's the possibility for genuine growth through difference. And that requires a level of maturity that goes far beyond conventional romance. It requires self-awareness. It requires having faced one's own psychological patterns and still choosing to evolve beyond them. They're not looking for perfection. They're looking for authenticity, a connection that might not feel immediately comfortable, but that offers the possibility of genuine growth through difference, where both can relate to each other not as extensions or reflections, but as genuinely other. And if that seems less immediately certain than the comfortable recognition they've known, perhaps that's precisely the point. Because they'd rather find genuine growth than continue mistaking narcissistic object choice for ideal compatibility, and to many still caught in unconscious pattern perpetuation that sounds like settling for less certainty. But it's really just psychological freedom in its purest form. If something inside you was touched by this exploration, maybe it's because deep down, you too are ready to examine the psychological reality behind your attraction to those who remind you of yourself. A reality that begins with honoring the power of narcissistic object choice. A relationship with yourself that acknowledges both the comfortable certainty of these attractions and their potential limitations for genuine growth. A clarity that can't be achieved through romanticization alone, but must emerge from increasing psychological honesty. And if that clarity hasn't fully arrived yet, maybe it's because you first needed to recognize that what feels like ideal compatibility might actually be narcissistic object choice, the extension of self-love rather than genuine connection with otherness. Something worth understanding rather than simply idealizing. And if this message found you at the right moment or awakened something you forgot was living inside you, then share it with others who might be silently questioning why their relationships with such striking similarity often provide immediate comfort yet limited growth. Because when something illuminates the soul, the least we can do is let it keep shining within us and through us.